Welcome to part 3 on Netflix's Messiah. In the first part, we talked a bit about some of the different characters and where they stood vis-a-vis the Al-Masih character and what maybe compelled their belief. In the second part of our videos here, we talked about healings and miracles and what those mean, specifically around Al-Masih's character and who is he? And then in this third part, we're going to continue that conversation, thinking about the character of Al-Masih, about issues around resurrection, about modern day messianic expectations, and what are we supposed to do if Al-Masih is true? So I'd like to thank you all for being here this morning and giving me your time to talk about these things. So Jenna, you had a question about resurrection that was a really good one. So maybe we'll just go ahead and start there.
Right. Yeah. I asked like what the natural process of resurrection is. So like if you use the example like, oh, if turning like water into wine is just speeding up a natural process, like what is resurrection speeding up in a naturalistic view?
Yeah. So resurrection is one of the great, probably the most impressive miracle that Al-Masih performs in the show and that Jesus performs in the Bible. Because that's the one thing we don't expect to have happen, right? That without like paddles on the chest pushing through electric shocks, we don't expect resurrection, and especially some of these more delayed resurrections, right? In the biblical text, you got Lazarus, he's been dead for 4 days. Jesus is in the tomb for a few days. Yeah, they're legit dead. It's not like they flatlined for a minute, but still close. Like, no, these people were like not mostly dead, they were all dead.
Yeah.
So well, I mean, it's a very good distinction, right? So with these all dead circumstances, what are the natural processes that might be sped up? So just to fill in those of you who are watching this, the idea of miracles as maybe speeding up of natural processes is something that the Victorian writer Charles Kingsley suggests. And I love his take on miracles because it does offer this vision that says, it's God working through the world, be that speeding up science or what we can identify as scientific processes, be that through the natural processes he's put in place, or be that through intervening. The point is God is still working in wondrous ways, and that doesn't change the goodness of it, especially when God speeds up his own processes or intervenes in them immediately. And that the question we need to be asking is why. And the example that one of Kingsley's examples is speeding up the changing, like water naturally changes into wine. It just takes a long time, right? It falls from the sky, it gets absorbed by the grapevine. We harvest the grapes, we ferment the grapes, we put them in casks, and eventually we get wine. And we know about this in Newburgh because it is a wine region. So it's a natural process sped up at the wedding at Cana with Jesus. Okay, this then gives birth to Jenna's question. Well, what is resurrection speeding up? Kingsley's answer is that Jesus only in the Bible heals or only resurrects people who are taken out at the prime of their life, and that's actually unnatural. That while it might be natural for the body to live a full life and eventually wind down in its 80s or 90s or 100s, that when we look at the people Jesus has raised from the dead, they're people who disease or the brokenness of the world have, whose lives have been cut short by those things. And so the restoration of that is a putting right something that has gone wrong in the world or something that's gone wrong within the natural process rather than even then a countervening of natural laws. So I find that a really interesting explanation from Kingsley's perspective. But I think the other thing with resurrection is like the great kind of push against the brokenness of the world.
Yeah.
Symbolically, but also practically, like death is the one thing that cuts at the heart of human community more than anything else, right? I think about the psalmist saying, how can we praise you when we're down in Sheol, right? Like death not only cuts us off from each other, it cuts us off from God. Right. In a really profound way. And you can get into eschatologies around, soul sleep and purgatory and, heaven and then the bodily resurrection and we get reunited to our bodies. I'm not really interested in going there right now. But the point is death, in any of those constructions, death is still this really problematic thing because it cuts us off from each other. And we know we're created for community if we take Genesis 1-3 seriously. And it cuts us off from God. And it's actually the sign of our alienation from God is death. So it seems to me that resurrection maybe isn't speeding up what we experience as a natural process, but calling us back to the way the world ought to be, that death is not the final word. If we're Orthodox Christian people, we confess, in the creeds, we believe in the resurrection of the dead, or in the other one, we believe in the resurrection of the body, right? That the resurrection is happening. So it's a speeding up toward that maybe eschatological future, but it's also, I think, this great sign of that this is not the way the world should be.
Right. Even as I asked the question, I was immediately thinking of like Eden and eschatology of like, oh, it's not, death is added in some sense, or it's a punishment. It's not what was meant to be. And so we're going back to like what it's meant to be, and whether or not you view that as like going back to Eden or going forward to like some sort of eschatological telos or whatever you want to call it. Yeah, like I can see that in like, oh, okay, it's not a natural thing, but that's okay and that's good.
Right. And so then I want to talk about the walking on water again with that in mind. When Jesus walks on water in the biblical text, it's very much shaped around ideas of having power over chaos. And we'll talk about that more next time, most likely. But I want to think about where he chooses to walk on water, where Al-Masih chooses to walk on water in this show, which again, I think it's actually pretty brilliantly written in terms of playing with telling the story of Al-Masih the same way the Gospels tell the story of Jesus. Like everything is symbolically loaded. He doesn't walk across the pool for Avri in private. He walks across the water between the Washington and Lincoln Monument. Now, I don't think there's probably a single setting in the world that is more representative of political power and privilege and global domination, and for good or bad, like either way, but like that is a profoundly loaded place for America, for global power, for American nationalism. If Jesus walking on water is symbolic, or this kind of sign of his power over chaos, water being an ancient symbol for chaos, what does it mean for Al-Masih to walk across the water, the Washington Monument?
I think it's also somewhat important to entertain the idea that when they were in Texas, Al-Masih told Felix to decide where they were going. And of course, where are you going to take like the second coming of the Messiah? You're going to take him to DC. So I think that's also a factor in it, is the fact that Felix kind of put him on display put him in this location to be on display. Yeah, which is a super important place. And Felix thought he was a super important person, So
Felix definitely starts them on that road trip, that direction. He could have headed toward LA, which would have been a different sort of story, also perhaps symbolically appropriate. They go east, but there's the moment when they're standing at the street sign. And this is, again, a moment that made me laugh as a lit professor, right? Because he's standing there, and if you notice, he sets his face toward DC. Like, right, it's his face and his nose are pointing toward DC on the street sign. And that should raise some echoes for you from the Gospels, right? He set his face toward Jerusalem. He set his face toward DC. So I thought it was a really playful thing on screen to do that. But so is Felix the one who chose DC? Or did Al-Masih choose DC? Or did Rebecca choose DC by posting it on Instagram and having everyone then decide that must be where they were headed because it was a cryptic photographic announcement?
I think the public decided.
The public decided.
I don't think Rebecca posted it with the intention of it being showing that they were going towards DC. I don't think that Al-Masih purposely faced his nose toward the right picture because he didn't know what angle she was taking that picture at. And Felix just followed what the public said.
Okay, so messianic expectations pushed him to DC just because that's where you go. If you're the Messiah, you go to the heart of power.
I would say there was in the van where it's just like Felix, his wife Anna, Rebecca, and then Al-Masih in the back. There is some sort of like, it seems like he's like directing him in some way, like through his glances, like Al-Masih is directing Felix. And so I think there's some sort of like direction that's not necessarily like Felix doesn't, I don't know if Felix feels like he's choosing. I think he thinks he's following some sort of like divine presence that's leading him there, but I don't know. It's very subtle.
Yeah.
I think Felix would have taken any possible like sign as like,
Right.
oh, this is, so I totally think that Golshiri could have like looked out the window and Felix would have been like, oh my gosh, he's telling me to do this.
Mm-hmm.
So like kind of like in both ways, it's, yeah.
Well, so this is an important thing to keep in mind as we read the Gospels as well, that there were all sorts of reasons that Jesus went to Jerusalem, right? Part of the reasons he went to Jerusalem more than once, although in some of the Gospels it sounds like he only ever went there once because of the way they're structured for their narrative points. There were lots of reasons, possibly his own decision to go there, also like cultural expectations. We're going there to celebrate Passover. It's because of this, right? And you get a similar sort of network of forces going on here. Like, why do they end up in DC? Well, they do, right? Maybe Al-Masih is somehow psychologically organizing the whole thing, from his glances to Felix and very intentionally being sure that the picture that goes up on Instagram, maybe it's just the inevitable place that all sort of messianic tales are going to end, is in the heart of power, whatever the regional heart of power is. Jerusalem, Rome, DC, right? But we end up there. Why does he choose to walk across, like, or what is the symbolic, if we're reading this symbolically, why walk across the water there? Just to amaze the crowds?
If you're going with the idea that water is representative of chaos, and that his walking over it is showing his like dominion over it or his sovereignty over it, then it's kind of Al-Masih stating that like actually like he has power over this like system and like this institution. And that like, oh, power isn't seated where you think it is, and that, oh, he's showing his like dominance and like all of that, but again in like a really subtle way.
Right, like you'd have to know enough about the first walking on water to be able to even read it as his showing his dominance over the American government, kind of military industrial complexes.
Right.
This symbol, this image of global power, right? No,
Yeah.
I can walk over the global power. Yeah.
And even enough to know like, oh, like what is God doing in creation? Like, oh, he's like subduing the chaotic waters of the deep. And like, so you'd have to know, oh, it's representative of that and of the Jesus walking on water thing and of the industrial complex, and like knowing that all of these are connected. So it takes a lot to like get to that point. But I mean, I think that's also just like a well-written show that would be that subtle, but that intertwining of those things.
Right. But there's a whole lot of people watching who have the background knowledge and are from a culture where they can totally see that, right? Like us, right? We watch it and we go, oh, it's like so cool. Like, look at the way he's, via the scriptwriter, fine. But the way he's showing his dominance over all of this by walking on water and playing on all these historical things. Well, that's kind of what a lot of the miracles in the Gospels also do.
For
right?
sure.
Assuming an audience that will get, like if you're walking on water in DC across the mall, that means something different than a backyard swimming pool where only one guy sees it.
Right.
So resurrection, the great miracle, but then we have this deeply symbolic miracle of walking on water that maybe is much less about the parlor trick than about what he's trying to communicate in terms of his what he thinks he has power over. I want to talk about one other healing that also to me feels like a resurrection, and that's his interaction with the prostitute, Eliana. We do get her name. In fact, that's one of the things he asks her for. What is your real name? We've spent a lot of time in this class talking about the biblical representations of women, how God interacts with women in the Hebrew Bible. And this was, of course, the scene that compels faith for Mathis. What did you guys make of this scene? Do you remember it?
It's interesting to see the like perpendicularness of like that scene and the dog scene that we talked about earlier, because this is the total opposite, where we, you might think that like he'll just turn her away because she's making these advances and that's not what he's there for. And you think he's just going to throw her out, but instead he like actually sits her down and talks with her and like talks through some of her main issues in life and like gets her to really turn around her life. And like you can see that when she leaves because she gives the money back to the person and walks away. And like that was, I don't know, I think that's one of the bigger miracles that we didn't all see that. It was like the viewers and Mathers that saw it and no one else there saw it. But it was also one of the most impactful ones. So
I think also what was impactful about that is because, of course, in the show, the viewers are trying to figure out if this is the Messiah. But in that situation, I truly didn't know where it was going to go.
Yeah.
And because if it wasn't the Messiah, I could totally see him also making advances. And, but he didn't. So that makes it like all the more impactful, I think, just because the viewers are genuinely like, don't know what's going to happen.
And it also has this like upward effect because the the senator that employs Eliana, she then like gives the money back and says like, I'm not going to do it, and like she kind of like confesses her belief in Al-Masih to this like dominant political figure, and he's like all mad at her like, oh, shouldn't you know how to like trick people and like all of that, and kind of like downplays like what she's going through. But still there's some sort of like testimony that is given to a person in a position of power because of that interaction between Eliana and Al-Masih. So there's something really like poignant about that.
Yeah, and the way that the senator tries to use her job experience, you know, to manipulate her out of her faith, right? You of all people should know when someone's faking it.
Right.
Is ever like a line designed to shame another human being?
Oh, it's that one.
Yeah. And I think the juxtaposition of that between the way that Al-Masih treats her, right? That like he doesn't allow her to just, it's my body, I can do what I want with it. It's like, well, are you? You're not even here by your own choice, right? So the ability to cut through some of the politics and the kind of common talking points to this actual human being who is being employed by the U.S. government to try to trap him. There's something really, I don't know, I find that scene to be really beautiful. And the way that he then like articulates her shame and tries and, you know, offers her space to come to herself again in that acknowledgement of her real name, right? Who are you for real? Is that the biggest miracle in the show? Or the biggest healing? I mean, it's not really a miracle. Like we wouldn't use the term miracle, but maybe it is. I don't know. Like, is that that's the scene also that provokes, I think, the comment, it doesn't matter if he's real, he's good.
I think the thing that I like about that scene the most is that there's no doubting that it's real, that her healing's real. Because a lot of the other miracles that happen in this show, you can't tell for sure if they're real, and that's like the biggest debate. But there's no doubt that like this woman was healed in like her heart. Like you don't have to doubt that, which is really good.
I think that's a really good observation. Yeah, that none of us question the reality of her healing. And we see it, I think that's where also the conversation with the chief of staff is so important, right? Because we know that it wasn't just like a momentary thing, like she gives back the money, she's done. She's not gonna play the Judas figure. And so yeah, there's definitely healing that comes from that interaction with him. This, now, as we're saying this is making me think about potentially Rebecca's healing as well, not from epilepsy, but from her abortion. Because that's another interesting one, right? They have that conversation on the bridge in DC, and then she goes back to the hotel, she goes for a swim the next morning, and she comes in and she comes clean with her dad. Like, and she seems to be freed from the shame that had kept her silent. Interestingly enough, without any comment on whether what she did was right or wrong or good. I mean, her dad certainly has opinions about it. But it seems like what matters is that she is no longer lying to herself or to others about what happened. Is that a moment of healing? Or is that just, or is it a moment of breaking? I mean, it seems to also kind of bring some problems within the marriage between Felix and his wife.
I think it has to do with truth, and like what their parents had before wasn't any better or any worse than what they had after coming clean. It was just a more genuine interaction of what's going on. But I do think it's interesting to look at like the outcome of the healing, because I can see with Eliana, she gives back the money and she's like, don't ever call me again. And like seeing how much it matters if he is the Messiah or if he's just a really good man, is when it, like, if she finds out that he isn't the Messiah for real, Eliana, I don't think that would make that much of a difference, because that was still human treating her a certain way. And it's hard to tell what Rebecca's what her, like, how she felt after when they heard that like the plane crashed or whatever. It's hard to tell if all the changes she had gone through were just like brought back and like undermined because he might not be the Messiah now. So and I don't know if that makes them more legitimate or less, or if that has anything to do with it, but it's like a different kind of healing. But you can definitely see her demeanor change after coming clean to her dad about the abortion. So.
Well, and if you remember back to our first video, one of the things that we were all saying we disliked Felix for was the sense of hypocrisy, right? And the sense of like pretending he had his life together when he didn't. And so does this also become a moment, or does it create an opportunity perhaps for Felix, if he chooses to find healing from the hypocrisy that he lives in? The question is will Felix take advantage of that too, right? I mean, he can no longer lie to himself about his life, right? It's not just bad circumstance, like his life is messed up, right? His family is messed up. He has not done a good job as a dad or as a husband. And how is he going to respond to that? With judgment, with harshness, with lecturing his wife and daughter about, we have beliefs, and they don't include a young girl having an abortion. Okay, it's funny the way he worded that. My thought was, do they include an old woman having an abortion? Like, is it because it's your daughter? Is that the problem? Or is it something bigger? Is he going to stay in that posture? Is he going to recognize his own maybe complicity in the situation? What sort of environment had he created in his home and in his marriage that had made it such that his daughter and wife felt like, we just can't tell dad about this? So it does create this sort of opportunity where Felix might find healing, and where that marriage might be able to finally start finding healing, and that father-daughter relationship. But we don't really see what happens, right? We don't know if Felix takes advantage of that.
He burns down the church, whatever that means.
He gives up on all of it, maybe. Death is too much. What do you think he does when he finds out Al-Masih's alive? I mean, we know he is, but Felix hasn't heard the news yet.
Have they heard the news that he could have been dead? Was that a part of the big announcement that said, like, hey, he's a liar? Did the greater public find out that the plane went down?
Well, it says, like, the lady on TV says something about the fact that, like, the Messiah is mortal or something like that. So it led me to believe that they did know that, like, the plane crashed or disappeared. I don't know.
I think that's a really good question. I think that there's reasons why we're led to believe that he had heard that he had died, although I don't think it's ever actually said in the news report. The other thing is, I think it was still very much a CI or a US government working with Israel behind the scenes, totally off the books to get him out of the country. So I don't think it would have been, I think in terms of the narrative logic, it doesn't actually make sense for them to have had that knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
It was just that he had a past, he had a family, he'd been institutionalized for his messianic complex in his 20s.
I think they are aware though that he's on the plane, right? Like that's been like they know that Al-Masih has like left the country and that he's headed toward, like we know that much. And I think it might just be that the CIA knows this, but I think they do say that like a plane that is like allegedly carrying him has crashed. And so there's some idea that like, oh, maybe he's dead.
Yeah. So, but whether he knows right at the moment he burns the church that he's dead, or whether he just knows that all this other stuff has come out.
I mean, there's also the big like symbolic thing of it saying false god. Is that what it says? Or yeah, on the side, and he comes back to that, and because originally he had like tried to like wash it off, meaning that he believed that that statement on the side of the church was untrue. Mm-hmm. But then when he came back, I think that it just felt too real and too true for him to be able to erase that and continue with the church. He had to completely destroy what was left over.
Yeah. So how do you come back from that as a pastor? I followed the false god who's now dead. Come and be in my flock anyway. Like that doesn't work well for a pastor. Or I was wrong about the whole thing to begin with, like the Jesus thing and the Al-Masih thing, right? So he has nowhere to go until he finds out that he's alive. But we don't get to see that, right? We don't know what happens.
But I mean, the greater public is already convinced that he's a liar.
Yeah.
And that Al-Masih is completely fake. Which, you know, based off of one news report, which, you know, could or could not be true, those kind of things.
Well, it's important to note everything in the news report is like circumstantial,
mm-hmm.
right? Like he was born in Iraq. Okay. He had parents that died. Yeah. He was raised by his uncle who was a street performer and a magician. Okay. Like all of that can be true and not undermine his messianic status.
Mm-hmm. Even the fact that he was treated at a like hospital for his messianic complex still doesn't necessarily negate what he believed he was.
Right.
Like it just says that somebody at some point decided that he was not that and then treated him because of it.
That's right. I mean, it's hard to imagine. I mean, I don't know that there is space in modern psychology for someone to actually be the Messiah, right? Like, the real Messiah would have a Messiah. Like, I don't see the real, like, yeah. If he's legit, I don't see how modern psychology would have space for that sort of a claim. Oh no, you tick all the boxes for the real Messiah as opposed to just the messianic complex. I'm not sure how that. I mean, you're a psych major, Cassie.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there room for like the real Messiah as opposed to just a complex?
No, not that I can see, but because like I don't know if we were talking about this during the break, but in biblical times, if there had been like a psychological knowledge and like programs and stuff, I think they would have probably put Jesus in the hospital for that. So.
And there's one line in the gospel, one of the gospels, where it talks about his family being outside and they were wanting to put him away quietly. There's like a hint that maybe they're has he lost his mind?
Yeah.
I will have that for next time. It would be one of the passages we'll look at if it's in Mark, and if not, I'll just reference it. Yeah.
I wonder though, with like the idea, especially like in Mark, of like the messianic secret, like, oh, don't tell people what I'm doing, like trying to remain subtle and like all of those things. Like if someone who remains in that style of being a Messiah would ever, I don't know, get to a point where they would be publicly like exposed for having like a messianic complex, or even like down to like what the even like what the word like Messiah means necessarily. Like I don't even know if messianic complex is fair to the word, just mean like anointed and used by God. Like I think that you can be a Messiah without having a messianic complex, if that makes sense.
But can you be the Christian understanding of the Messiah without having a without having a messianic complex?
I think that depends on what your Christian understanding of the Messiah is, and like what attributes you equate to what it means to be like the Christ, or to be this like salvific figure, if even that's what you believe the Messiah is, some sort of eschatological salvific figure.
So it would depend on our construction of a Messiah.
Right.
I mean, it's important to note that in the Gospels, like, so there's the one mentioned that it sounds like his family is getting concerned about his psychological health. And other people say that he's possessed by a demon.
Yeah.
So it seems that not everyone was on board with Jesus's complete mental health in the first century.
Also, at some point with Jesus's disciples, I'm pretty sure, like they're preaching or talking at some point, I don't know where this is in the Bible, but and people say like, are they drunk? No, it's 9 a.m. or something like that. And so that also, like this man who has like a Messiah complex is influencing these other people who are also like believing this, and people do think they're kind of going crazy.
Right. Well, that's at Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit sends them in tongues, and are they drunk? It's like, it's only 9 a.m. What's up?
Yeah.
There is some really funny moments like that in the biblical text. We just don't hear because we forget that it's okay for the Bible to be funny. I love the point. So there's a point where somebody comes to him like, are you the Messiah? And he's like, what do you think? And I love it because, of course, John the Baptist sends some of his followers to Jesus and asks the same thing. Are you the Messiah, or should we be looking for another? And Jesus doesn't answer the question. He says, go and tell John what you see. Right? Kind of throws it back in the same way. So I think I'm hoping from watching this as we go and read Mark for the next couple of weeks, that a lot of these dynamics will just be a lot more obvious to us. That like, what does it mean for Jesus to be the Messiah? What does it mean to claim that? What sort of messianic expectations was he fulfilling but also undermining? And I think that's one of the things to think about as we consider this TV show. What are our modern expectations around what the Messiah should be, and how might that be shaping our reading of Al-Masih's character? So I think, Jenny, you kind of brought this up. What do you think our messianic expectations are in the 21st century?
Goodness. I think that depends on what your like theological camp is. I think that sometimes more progressive or liberal leaning churches tend to view Christ as more of like a like subversive political martyr type figure, and so they would assume that the second coming would come and be in that sort of way. And then there are some people that would hope for like a second coming of Christ to be a like resurgence of Christendom and be more of like a Christ dominating everything, being the king of all kind of thing. And so I think it depends just like what like church you affiliate with, like what your view of Christ and the gospel is, and then how you would see that mirroring to how you would view Christ now. So like dependent is my answer.
Okay, so what we talk about is socio-political Christ, right?
Right.
Messiah who comes and brings an end to war, gets rid of oppressive governments and regimes, who restores the orphan and the widow and the alien in the land, right? Kids are not in cages at the southern border, families are not being separated, systemic racism is Israel and Palestine sort out their problems and everyone is happy. Russia quits doing its thing.
And I think almost, and I'm speaking for a lot of people right now when I say I think almost, but I think almost most, or if not all, like Christians desire those things to happen. I think it's the way in which that happens and the way in which Christ brings us forth is where the debate like comes in. And that even happens when you look at like the biblical Jesus of like, oh, he is doing these things. He is like stopping oppression and like setting captives free and doing all of that and like quoting like Isaiah in doing so, like in like what is it in the very first like the inaugural sermon like in Luke, like he's referencing like, oh, I am doing all those things. He's just not doing them how they thought he was going to do them. And so I think that's where it comes into play, like, oh, okay, is the outcome matching up with how I think the outcome will come to fruition?
Yeah.
Also, again, when Golshiri talks with the president, and then he makes like a statement of how me and the president spoke about world peace. That's like a pretty, I feel like that's like we're talking about politically, that's a pretty fair expectation, I guess, of a second coming or whatever.
So, I mean, it is interesting that I think you're right, Jenna, that basically all Christians expect some sort of socio-political peace.
Right.
And yeah, and then Cassie, you're right to point out, like, we do expect that with the second coming, right? That somehow peace is a part of this. Interestingly, though, as I think you both kind of were hinting out, that that's something we expect for the future, but we all also recognize that Jesus might have been doing something like that in the first century. It was very much not in the way anyone expected, because they had similar political messianic expectations, right? That when the Messiah comes, he's going to restore Israel to its kind of place, to some sort of, back to some idealized vision of the Davidic dynasty. Rome's going to get put back in its place and kicked out of here. And that's not exactly what happened. At least not in any sort of immediate sense, and not in any, I mean, yeah, that's not what it looked like. So one thing I guess that's interesting to note is how much our messianic expectations today for whatever we expect for the second coming look very much like messianic expectations for the first coming that were not what it looked like. And maybe that's something really important to think about just kind of as we're going into Mark, is that our expectations for how God is going to show up are very seldom the way that God shows up.
Mm-hmm.
We expect God to heal the dog. Al-Masih shoots the dog. We expect God to fix big socio-political problems now when he comes, and yet Jesus doesn't even ever go to Rome. What do we expect from Al-Masih? Why do we not, what causes us to not believe that he is Jesus returned? And maybe this is where we start talking about the bombing at the end of the next to last episode, right? The bombing of the Palestinian mosque. I mean, shouldn't he have stayed there with the refugees on the border and made sure they got across safely and fixed Palestine and Israel?
This doesn't really answer the question necessarily, but it was something I was thinking about throughout the show. Is it seems like in the show, it seems like Al-Masih brings destruction, like wherever he goes, he's surrounded by destruction. Then I was also thinking, that isn't that where Jesus would go, is where destruction is happening? Mm-hmm. But just, I don't know, I don't have any conclusions about that, but I was thinking about that because of like the border, that's pretty destructive. Ton of people are there, thirsty, hungry, and sick. And in Israel, I think where he was before, there was, of course, again, there was probably unrest there before Al-Masih showed up. So it was kind of something I was thinking about. I don't know.
So he's going to places where there are already pre-existing problems, but he is also not fixing those problems.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And once he, like the end of the show, for some reason, I don't know why, but I had like expected the show to be like, oh, in the end, like something huge happens. People are like transformed. I was probably too positive about it. But like at the end, it's just destruction after destruction, like devastation everywhere. And like Ava drives by her, like Ava's dad is forgetting, and Ava drives by her apartment, looks up and can see him like pacing, and then she drives away. And there's this plane crash, and there's this death of Rhea, the little girl, and there's this epileptic episode that Rebecca has. So it's, I don't know, there's just like a lot of destruction. And so I couldn't necessarily tell if like his presence brought destruction or if he went to the places where there were destruction or there was devastation.
If the world is broken, if the way things are is not the way that things ought to be, then it seems that for them to get from where they are to where they ought to be is going to involve some pretty profound disruptions. And so the question then becomes, are the disruptions and the destructive things that are happening, are those like necessary sorts of destruction that will make space for redemption and new creation, or are they just pointless destruction?
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting, like I don't think that we get very many answers on that, although I think every single one of those situations individually we could talk about and say, well, you know, the die was kind of cast a whole lot earlier based on a series of decisions that the people involved had made. Had the group of refugees not gone to Jordan but stayed at the border and waited, they all would have gone across with Jibril, and they all would have been taken into the moderate group that was working for some sort of two-state peace solution, right? But instead, some of them go to Jordan, where they end up being placed with the radicalized group, and then they come in and they blow up the Palestinian mosque. So was that because of destruction that Al-Masih brought, or was that because the people didn't wait long enough, didn't wait for their, use a really biblical term, right? They didn't wait for their salvation long enough. The same thing with Rhea dying. As Jenna brought up in another video, was that because Al-Masih failed to save her, or is that because her mom essentially kidnapped her and took her away from life-saving treatment without even her husband being on board? I mean, there's some real problems already in that relationship. Mm-hmm. So was that Al-Masih's fault, or is that on the family for not being grateful for and interacting with the resources that were already there? Felix's burning of the church. He was going to do that from the beginning, right? So in some ways we just see what the course he was already on gets delayed, but not by enough to change him. Rebecca, we don't know. I mean, she has the epileptic fit, but she's still alive.
Yeah.
She seems to have she seems to be in a much better place personally than where we saw her when the show opened. We don't see the fallout like over the long term of her life, but there seems to be something deep inside of her that has been healed, even if she's still epileptic. We know the prostitute has been healed in a deep way. I want to talk more about Avri and Ava, because I think they're actually really important characters here. Ava seems upset that Al-Masih is dead. And I want to think about why that is. And then I want to think about Avri and his resurrection. What does he do with this? I think that's going to be an important answer to some of these questions, because you're right, there is destruction everywhere he goes. He's going to the places of destruction and suffering, but his presence seems to bring a sort of destruction and suffering, but it also seems to bring a sort of healing. Mm-hmm. Especially for, I mean, Matthews as well, right? He seems to there's some sort of healing that goes on in him as well. And again, we're not even sure what that looks like, but just something seems at peace or restored in him in some way or other. And the working out of that is complicated, but it still seems present. So let's talk about Ava, and then let's talk about Avri, okay? So Ava leaves the room when she finds out the plane has crashed, and she kind of like, she sits down on the floor, right? What did you guys make of her response to that?
just want to say her job didn't like allow her to believe that he was real. Like she didn't even stand a chance in that sense, because her whole job was to try and debunk him for someone that, you know, is just a normal guy with mental health issues. So, you know, even I think maybe she wanted to believe it more than she was kind of allowed to believe. And then finding out that he died was like kind of like the nail in the coffin, you know, that was like, oh man, like, was I right? Was I wrong? Everything that I've been working for has just been thrown out the window, and I didn't even give myself the chance to like actually like find him and talk to him, kind of a thing.
Yeah. Because she was really disturbed by how much he knew about her, right? Both she and Aubrey were troubled by his insights into their souls, really, right? You know, their personal past, their biography, but also the way he could seem to like get under their skin, I think is the way that one of them puts it. But she never does give herself a chance to consider that his claims might be true, or that the way people are talking about him, because Jen is right, he never makes one claim, never says anything about himself other than he's doing what his father tells him, sort of thing. She never can't really entertain the possibility. But on the other hand, shouldn't she be happy that he's dead? Like, here's this problem, this political threat that's going to just destabilize the status quo. He's been removed.
Well, I think it's because what started out as like a job became more of like a personal like quest to understand and to maybe like try to believe or like see if there's any hope for like what this guy represents in her own life. And so I think that the devastation that we see is where we see this like kind of like melding of like, is this work that she's doing, or is this like her own like personal desire to figure out what this is? So like, yeah, I guess the work side of her would be happy, like, oh yeah, like this threat is gone, that's great. But I don't think the work side of her is what is actually like functioning at this point or like motivating any of her actions. You can even see like her boss is like upset and disappointed in some of the like routes that she's taken to like continue on with this like case or whatever you want to call it. And so yeah, I think you see that this has become very personal and it's not just a professional thing anymore for her.
Yeah. Which reveals, I think, right? Or she wants to prove it so that the like this kind of niggling thoughts of like, what if this is possible, can be put to bed forever, right?
Right.
Like she wants to get away from faith maybe, but she can't for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
She wants it to be true, but can't believe. You can see that whatever it is, there's this deep tension in her though.
Yeah. Well, and I think even like reflexive of Christ's like crucifixion, like Christ dying on the cross didn't take away the things that he did before he died. And like we know as like Christians, like the punchline to that story is like, oh, he's resurrected. But so I don't even think that Al-Masih dying takes away any of that like hope or tension or like desire for hope that she has of like, oh man, like because he did know a lot about her, she did witness and see a lot of the things that he did, and that doesn't just go away because of death.
Right. Good point. And what about Aubrey? We talked, I think, in the first video about his shame, like that if Ava seems to have lost her faith or to have never really had a strong faith, but it's been made impossible by her husband's death, by her father's skepticism and kind of just the family history there. Aubrey seems to not be a person of faith because of maybe what he's done. And because of what he's experienced in his mom's death and, you know, the violence, but especially the violence he's been a part of himself and inflicted on others. What do you think? I mean, I love it that it ends with just Aubrey looking at Al-Masih reaching his hand out to the other guy who's just been resurrected, who's kissing his hand. Mm-hmm. And Aubrey's just looking on, right? Like, What do you think he does? What's your prediction for his character at that moment?
I think it's going to have like a profound impact on him, mainly because now that they're in this kind of remote place, that kid had no motivation for telling him something that didn't happen. Like the kid is just there and was like, yeah, I saw you guys, you were dead, now you're alive. And like this kid has no idea any like, yeah, he like doesn't necessarily have a personal agenda for that situation. So I think it's going to have a big impact. I'm not sure how.
But we know the kid likes to tell tall tales.
Yeah.
That is true. I didn't think about that.
On the other hand, the plane crashed.
Yeah, but we as viewers never see like Avram looking gray and having flies coming out of his mouth and like all of those things like the kid describes. And like, yeah, like when you see the kid with like his schoolmates, like he does tell tall tales. And so you don't know like, oh, is this like leading into the exaggeration? Another thing, it's visually so odd and stunning that they've crashed in the desert, but it's a field of like bright poppies. Like that visual aspect of it is very interesting too, that Al-Masih doesn't look like touched at all. Like he's very like white and pristine looking, like in his clothes. And so like it's a visually like weird scene. And then having this like kid that tells like tall tales like inserted in that is very odd and jarring in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, there's reasons why we as viewers can discount it, right? The visual nature of it, it's not real. Well, but the kid's there, yeah, but he exaggerates. So it must have been like a crash landing, not a real crash. And they just survive. But then Al-Masih looks way too good and pristine.
Right.
To have actually been through a plane crash. And okay, like even so, like even the crash landing theory, like clearly at least one of the people is dead.
Plane's like cut in half, isn't it?
Yeah, the plane. It was not a gentle crash landing. It was a. I don't like my odds in any plane crash. I've just got to be honest. Pretty reasonable to assume one dies in a plane crash. Yeah. So, and again, I love this because it sets up so much the dynamics of belief around the resurrection, right? Like, well, maybe he just fainted on the cross, right? It's kind of exactly the argument that we've got here. And this is one of the longstanding theories that to undermine the bodily appearances of Christ after his death is that he wasn't really resurrected because he never really died. Right, and it's the fainting theory that he had fainted or passed out. Those poor, first century folks didn't know the difference, and they entombed him anyway, but he was really still alive. And after a good night's sleep, he was back up, which is exactly what we just entertained with the plane crash, right? It wasn't it was a crash, it was bad, but they didn't actually die, and the boy tells tall tales anyway. But we're also watching it, right? So we have that. We're not just hearing the report of the kid, we are watching it. So all that to say, I love the way that it opens up a lot of the dynamics around the death and resurrection. Like, did he really die? Well, if they really died and they really crashed and now they're alive, like, surely that means something.
Yeah. And I think opening up the death and resurrection actually comes back to something like Cassie was talking about, like, oh, like this destruction and like all of those things. Like, you can view the gospel as like an epic story with like an embarrassing finish, or like a boring story with like a really beautiful finish. And like, oh, like the resurrection. So like, it's like, the destruction or like the crucifixion like is necessary in some sense, you know what I mean? And so like him bringing forth these things like, oh, destruction wherever he goes, Christ kind of does that too. And the ending is a lot of like destruction with a great like resurrection ending, like ultimately, but still it's there that like you have this like gruesome like end.
Yeah. So what should Aubrey do? He's just been resurrected. I mean, there's this in episode 7, I think it is, when they're in the college classroom, and back in the days when we got to be in classrooms together. The funny moment watching it. But of course, there's only like 10 people sitting in the class because everyone else has left for the imaginary disaster that's striking the world, right? They're all off following Al-Masih or having their kind of love in. I had a very funny moment watching them throw the toilet paper. I was like, don't they know they shouldn't be doing that? So and also I was also kind of like, why do college students want to decorate the quad with toilet paper when they think that maybe the Messiah has returned? It was just an odd sort of response, right? And so we've got that whole scene. They're out on the quad and they're giving each other hugs and they're getting high and they're throwing rolls of toilet paper in the air because this is how you celebrate Jesus returning.
Definitely.
That's my response.
To be doing. But then the students who are still in the classroom, right? They're talking about like, let's talk about this. And one of the students says, I'm afraid he might be for real. Because like, if he is, what does that mean? And I think that's a real, like, I love that moment because it kind of cuts through a lot of the questions, you know, the dynamics of belief. But okay, if he is for real, what are we supposed to do? And the student says, if he's real, what are we supposed to do? Give up everything and worship him?
I mean, isn't that what we're supposed to be called to before?
Well, if he's real.
Like,
I mean, that's what that moment kind of pulls us down to, right? It's like, well, if this is for real, if we really believe that Jesus is God incarnate, who died and rose from the dead, like for real, what do we do with that? I mean, it does seem like giving each other hugs, getting high in the quad, and throwing toilet paper in the air is probably not the right response or a sufficient response. So what do we do with that? And I think that's what I love about that closing scene with Audrey as well. Is like, well, what do you do with that? Do you stand there in the light of this resurrected Messiah and say, who has brought you back as well, and continue to say, no, that's a bunch of tricks, I'm not going to buy into that? Do you acknowledge that he is what he seems to be? Like, do you accept that? And then what do you do with that information? What do you do if it's real? I think this is a really hard question for Christians, because it brings us to that moment of realizing that is exactly what we claim. Like, that is in terms of the intellectual, we've talked a lot in this class about intellectual aspects of faith as well as like practice aspects of faith, right? And that the life of faith is always this constant engagement between, you know, practice and intellect. But this is the intellectual component of that, the practice component, right? Like, if we really believe this, what do we do with that? Do we give up everything and follow him? And I love the way the student asks it too, because it's kind of in that tone, right? Like for real?
And I think for the student who's coming from like a position of like disbelief or like skepticism of it, like that question comes from a like idea of like, oh, like I know at least like in a headspace kind of sense, like, oh, if I don't follow God, like there's sorts of like punishments that happen. So I think it's coming out of a place of fear too, of like, oh, if this is real and I don't submit to the fact that it's real, am I going to like suffer in some way at like the hand of what's happening here? And I think like evading suffering or like evading hell is actually a motivation for a lot of like Christians, that like they want to live in a certain way, not always because it's like good for people or it's liberating or that it's like helpful in some sort of way, but because they don't want to experience like damnation in some sense. And so I think for the student, I think that's what they're getting at, not necessarily like, oh, how do I act to like my fellow neighbor and like how do I like show a love of God and a love of like community. I think they're asking like the hell evading question.
Okay. I think you're right. That's probably at least part of what's motivating that student is the fear of like, well, what does this mean?
Right.
Consequences, right? Like if it's real, do I actually have do I still have the freedom to say no to it? Mm-hmm. Right? If I do, what are the consequences of saying no to something? Not because it's about a belief or kind of choosing to identify with a faith tradition, but like, no, this is like a real thing in front of me and I'm either on board with it or I'm not. And what are the consequences of saying no to it? Yeah. Right? But I think there's also though the question embedded in that, because he says, give up everything and worship him. Mm-hmm. I think there's also though, especially where it cuts into the scene in the quad, like, what does that mean? Like, is that worshiping him? Is that following? Like okay, let's say you choose to say, okay, I am on board with this. What does that look like? What does that mean in terms of the sort of radical call that places on our lives? Because you do get the sense that if this is for, like, within the story world of Messiah, if Al-Masih is who he claims to be, or who people claim he is, and who his actions seem to be allowing him to be identified with, What is the appropriate, right response to that? I think it's a really hard question. Because it drives us deep into ourselves, right? Like, what would I do? And I think we've got to be clear that, like, joining the bandwagon of people tramping around the US on a road trip to hear him speak in an arena, which he never actually does, doesn't seem to be the answer. Do you notice how much he avoids the crowds? So that doesn't seem to be what he is even asking people to do.
Mm-hmm.
What is he asking people to do? But can you continue to just go about your daily business the same way? Is that what you're being called to? I mean, I think it really pulls us into these dynamics of what is real, what does a life in response to this messianic claim look like? And it doesn't show us. It just ends, right? We don't, season 2. And of course, everything we've said, like in this entire video series, could be undermined by a season 2, right? He could be revealed to be the Antichrist. He could be revealed to be actually Jesus. And, you know, the resurrection could be revealed to be a hoax within the story world, right? I mean, there's all sorts of ways that the ending of the story, if there was a season 2, could change it. Right now, as it stands, it is a perfect sort of arc on and riff on the gospel texts, right? So it kind of ends there. You know, what do you do with that? Who do you say that he is? And I think maybe that's a good question for us just to leave ourselves and our viewers with, and to encourage the class to kind of chime in on, either on social media or through Foxtail or through email. I think there's really good reason to take this show very seriously. Not because I think we are called necessarily to decide whether Al-Masih is for real Jesus or not. It's a fictional show, right? This is a work of fiction. But I think it has an incredible power to play back onto our own lives and to demand of us that this very timely question, considering that we are not only in quarantine, in realizing the very presence of death and destruction in our society, but also as we are approaching Holy Week. Palm Sunday is Sunday, and then Easter Sunday is a week from now. What does it mean to be people who live a life of faith and claim that there is this real historical thing that happened where God became a human being, where that God died on the cross and rose 3 days later for real from the dead? What is the right response if we take that seriously? Especially if it doesn't, I mean, Felix's response obviously is not the right one. Whose response is right? What should Avri do as a person who has been resurrected with Christ? And you should be hearing echoes right now of Paul as I say that, right? What is it to be raised to new life in Christ? That's what has happened literally for Avri. How should he now live if you're writing his story? And then to realize that in asking that question of that character, really what we're doing is we're asking that question of our own characters. How should we then live if we have been resurrected with Christ? And we can't ignore that reality in our own lives. And we know that he knows our most shameful, horrible things that we have done, even if they include torturing a boy who before his birth, his father did something awful. And so you torture and kill him anyway. Even if it involves being a pretty bad father in a lot of ways. Even if it involves all the ways we've been hurt by violence and the death of people we love and religious breaking all around us that have touched our own families in such a deep way as Avri's experience with the death of his mother. All of that's in the open. All of that is known. You have died. You have been raised to new life in Christ. What do you do? What is the appropriate response in that moment? We will get to continue thinking about this in a much more literal context as we delve into the Gospel of Mark over the next 2 weeks. I hope that all of you who are watching, hopefully in my class, but also if any of you who have found this on YouTube and are enjoying this conversation, I hope you join us again for conversations around Mark during Holy Week and then the week after, as well as we continue to think about what does it look like to live in response to being raised to new life. What should Avri do? Thank you so much for your time, girls.